I want to welcome everybody to our September general meeting. This is obviously Tortoise Group. If you're in the wrong room, you're welcome to stay. So a couple administrative things I want to go over. We have a guest speaker today, Lesley DeFalco from Usgs, and Lesley's going to be sharing with us some interesting information about various desert plant species, and specifically some of the work that her group is doing with tortoises and what tortoises do in the wild, basically. It'd be pretty interesting. I'm looking forward to this.
And without further ado, I would like to introduce Lesley DeFalco with USGS, and she's going to be talking about the Desert Restoration Project and a lot of cool things.
Today I'm going to talk about restoring desert tortoise habitat. We've had some incredible burns over the last several years, and I'm going to talk in particular about burns that we experienced, or fires that came through in 2005 and 2006. Seems like a really long time ago, but those fires are still really important today when we think about desert tortoise habitat. Advance, next slide. So in our Mojave Desert, you know, when you're driving between here and St. George, Utah, or you're driving down to Los Angeles, you go through shrubland habitat. You see creosote bush and these smaller plants that are associated with creosote bush called burr sage. And then, of course, the Joshua trees, right? You all know these species pretty well? I see some heads going up and down. Okay. Those are really important lands for the wild desert tortoises to live in, and so tortoises will live in these low and middle elevation shrublands. They're just barely getting up into what's called blackbrush. That's the right-hand photograph there. It has that darker vegetation in the foreground, and then those tall Joshua trees that so many of us love and know so well. On the left-hand side, that's sort of the typical lower elevation creosote bush, burr sage. It looks a little less vegetated, and there's a more open space in between. But tortoises, this is where they hang out in the wild, and they need to make it in this habitat. It's really difficult because it's, of course, you only get about 4 inches of rainfall a year where we live here in the Mojave. So not much water, which means not much vegetation. And we also have a lot of solar radiation, which this is an ectothermic herbivore, which means that they rely on their environment for heating up and cooling down. It presents some challenges. In the summertime, they have to shuttle between shrubs to stay cool and get into the shade. And in the wintertime, they usually stay below ground, but they need those shrubs still for making their burrows, because the root systems make the integrity of their holes really suitable for hanging out for the entire winter. Well, in 2005 and 2006, do you all remember the wildfires that we had around the city? We had about 1 million acres that burned or reburned during that time period, which is about 4% of the total shrublands that we have here in the Mojave Desert. The Mojave Desert extends into Southern California, Southern Nevada, northwestern Arizona, and a little bit of the southwestern tip of Utah. So that's, even 4% seems like a small number, but that's in 1 year, one time period. That was a lot of habitat, or a lot of shrubland habitat to burn. And that also means that about 5% of the federally designated habitat under the Endangered Species Act was impacted by these fires. This is the top right map just shows you kind of where we are in the Mojave Desert. That's that gray, sort of Mickey Mouse shaped gray blob. That's the Mojave Desert. And then I just wanted to show you in this lower figure that with these fires that we experienced, which are the red and the blue, the red from 2005 and the 2006 is in the blue, these were all scattered fires. But you can see in the northeast Mojave Desert where we are, we had quite a bit of fires during that period. Okay, so something that not a lot of people know, when we think about wildfires, we're thinking a lot about what's going on in California. We think about western lands that are burning and they're impacting habitations for humans. Well, that system is typically adapted to deal with fire, but our system, our plants, do not do very well with burn injury. And that's why, the reason why is because these are fueled by invasive annual grasses. And maybe some of you have been walking out in the desert and you get those little stickers in your socks, those little burrs from the brome grass. And what happens is that those grasses, and you can see in the right photograph at the Jacob 06 fire, it comes into these areas after it burns and reestablishes, and it burns again and again and again. And these are invasive species that have come over from Europe and Asia, and they've been here since the late 1800s. They don't seem to be leaving anytime soon. So we have to try to figure out how we're going to deal with the potential loss of desert tortoise habitat from these recurrent fires, and what does that mean for our wild populations? These fires have multiple effects on tortoise habitat. They disrupt what are called these fertile islands beneath the shrubs. And beneath the shrubs, you get seeds being captured for plants that tortoises need to eat. You get nutrients for growing those plants. We also have this altered disturbance regime where we keep getting fires over and over and over again. It keeps destroying habitat, making it less suitable over time if it burns multiple times. And then we also get a depletion of the seeds. The really cool thing about the Mojave Desert is that it holds all of its seeds for future generations in the top inch of soil. I mean, it's extraordinary if you think about it. Those seeds are there for decades, just waiting for the best conditions for growing up into new plants for tortoises, or for food for tortoises, or for new shrubs that they can use for shuttling between during the summertime. These species on the right-hand side are the invasive annual species that are causing some of the problems. The top one is brome grass, the middle one is Mediterranean grass, and the bottom one is storksbill. And you probably have seen some of these around town yourself. But the one that's on top is the one that's causing the biggest problem with regard to fires. And this is kind of hard to see, but this is showing you a landscape where we have a fire. You can see kind of the lighter foreground here. That burn line, and that's a huge amount of habitat. And so the question is, can tortoises even use that habitat anymore, or have they lost that and now they have nowhere to go? You not only have the loss of individuals that burn up in a fire, but now you have potentially poor quality habitat that they can't move back into. So this is a question that's the burning question that we restoration ecologists are very interested in trying to solve. So we've been doing this for several years now, since those 2005 and 06 fires. There's a bunch of sites that I've represented here where we've been studying for about, well, more than 10 years, trying to look at various techniques for getting vegetation back on the landscape that the tortoises need. So what we're trying to do now with that study, so many years later, is we're trying to bring the tortoise into the whole restoration fold. How can we actually join what we're learning with our restoration with what the tortoise needs? And so we've been working with a lot of tortoise biologists, including Christina Drake, who I think spoke to you recently with the tortoise group. And she's up there in the top left corner with a big grin on her face. She's got her hands on a tortoise. She's been helping with some of these small tortoises and trying to understand what their blood work tells about their health and their well-being and what we're doing. And as Kobe mentioned, several of us in the room. I see Bob, I see Kobe and Sarah. We're all out there on Wednesday releasing these little tortoises, and we release them in the areas that we restored, where we had that nice seed response, where we got a lot of perennials getting in there, the short-lived perennials. And then we put them in areas that are called control groups, so where they haven't had any kind of seeding. What we want to do is see if their health and well-being changes with regard to the restoration effort, right? So if you restore an area, it's kind of like if you build it, will they come? And so that's what we're trying to address with some of this research. And so you can see some of the photos on Wednesday where we're releasing tortoises in the shade of some of these yuccas, and then we were carrying them out, as Kobe was saying, with these each individual containers. And then we would release them, and there's a hole in the background. This one in particular, I think you remember this one, Bob, kind of went in there and turned around and said, well, maybe I can find something better. And so what we're trying to see now is if they can get settled in before the winter comes. I didn't have time to put the map in here, but I wanted to give you an update. All the tortoises the day later were still alive, which is thumbs up, because we weren't sure if maybe they would die from predators. Predators might find them and eat them. Also, they might be exposed being on the surface, but no, they're all still there, and they're moving around quite a bit. And it looks like the ones that are in the unburned area are moving around less, probably because they have more cover, and the ones that are in these burned areas where there's less vegetation, they have to try to figure out, wow, where am I going to brumate this year? I got to find a good place. We humans tried to find adequate space for them when we released them, but what do we know? We don't know much about tortoise apartment hunting. So these guys are still out there looking around, but they're all alive as of as of Thursday. That's good news. This is the outplanting, which happens this time of year. So starting now until about December, we're going to be taking all of this nursery-raised seed stock, and now they're all these beautiful seedlings that are about 6 months old, and we're going to be planting them by hand. And as I said, each year we do about 30,000, and so it takes a lot of work. This is just showing you when we do our training. We've got the out there with the augers, and they're doing almost 30,000 holes that way. And if you've ever dug in the desert, you've got rocks, you've got caliche, you've got all sorts of stuff that make it really difficult to dig holes. But this is sort of the finished version here. This is the bursage seedling, this is creosote seedling, and this is the Joshua tree seedling. Okay. So one thing that came up early on is, wow, this is a lot of soil. As Sarah mentioned, you can have 40 to 50 pounds if you're in a remote location. It's not like you can just pull up in your RV. We have 30 people carrying these out to the desert to plant them because we want it to be in wild tortoise habitat. We don't need it by the road. We don't want the tortoises to be in the road. We want them to be out in their habitat. And so this requires a lot of work. One thing that restoration ecologists have done in the past is they said, well, if you take them out of the soil, you bare root them, and you wrap them in some wet material, you can actually keep them in that wet material for a couple days and then plant them without any negative effect. And actually sometimes can enhance their survivalship. And I was like, well, I don't know, desert conditions, you take that plant out of the ground, it's going to dry up, it's going to just be, it's dry out here. Matter of fact, it was 3% humidity. That's the lowest percent humidity about 3 or 4 days ago that I've ever seen in the Mojave Desert. So if you have a wet rag, you know how fast it's going to dry out if you have it exposed to the air. So I'm just thinking, I don't know about this, what's called jelly rolling, but as a scientist, I said, hey, let's test it. Let's see if it works. So that has been employing a lot of y'all volunteering to help out with this jelly rolling technique and testing that in an experimental design. So we have been planting the seedlings just straight out of the pots. These are called plant bands. They don't have any bottoms to them. They're just a band of like plastic or wax coated cardboard, and it's got soil in it. And when you stick it in a hole and you pull up that pot, the plant goes right into the hole, and then you pat it down and you put a little cairn around it to protect it from rodents and rabbits. But the other technique is actually taking it out of the soil and putting it in this moistened paper. And when we were starting this out, people said, well, some folks have used burlap. I've thought about, well, what can we use besides burlap? And so at the time, my dog was kind of getting towards the end of her life, and she needed wee-wee pads, so I went to the Costco or Petco and bought some wee-wee pads, and they're sure enough, you wet them and they absorb a lot of water, like 7 times the normal weight. And I thought, well, that's going to be great because you hold it up and the water doesn't come out, so that'll be a great environment for a plant that you're trying to transport. So that's what we've used so far. Well, thank you so much for your patience, and I hope to see you out there jelly rolling.
Thank you, Lesley. That was awesome. And I have to tell you professionally, going out on Wednesday and then hearing Lesley talk, it makes me say, oh, we're doing something positive. A lot of times we feel like we're just putting our finger, in a giant dam that's about to burst, but we're doing really good stuff, and thank you, Lesley. That was a nice presentation.